It begins with a quiet street in a small Egyptian town, the kind of place where people believe they know everything about their neighbors. The call to prayer echoes faintly in the distance, shop shutters roll down, and families gather for the evening meal. To outsiders, this town of Abu Nimras in Giza seems ordinary, peaceful even. But behind the walls of one modest house, a silence was building, a silence so heavy that when it finally broke, it left 2 lives lost and a community forever scarred. What price do we pay when secrets are buried instead of spoken? What happens when a marriage built on fragile trust becomes a prison of unspoken resentment? In 2017, this question was answered in blood. The story that follows is not just about a crime. It is about silence. Silence that allowed arguments to fester. Silence that blinded neighbors to danger. Silence that, in the end, cost a mother and child their lives. The man at the center of this tragedy was a husband, a father, someone who, to the outside world, appeared ordinary. He ran errands, greeted people in the street, and kept his head down. Yet inside his home, the picture was far darker. Behind closed doors, arguments echoed between him and his wife. Relatives later described a marriage weighed down by jealousy, distrust, and financial pressures. Some said he believed his wife was hiding things from him, messages, secrets, or perhaps simply her discontent with their life together. By the spring of 2017, these suspicions had taken root deep inside him. They became an obsession, one he fed by replaying every word, every gesture, every perceived slight. And like so many tragic stories, the people closest to him, his wife and his baby daughter, were the ones who would pay the price. Neighbors recall seeing the couple argue more frequently in the months before the crime. The wife, a young woman in her 20s, tried to shield her infant daughter from the tension, often retreating into another room when voices rose. Friends noticed her growing quiet, avoiding questions about her marriage, and yet she stayed, perhaps for her child, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because, in a society where divorce still carries heavy stigma, leaving wasn't a real option. The husband, meanwhile, became more withdrawn. He avoided family gatherings, stopped visiting friends, and spent long hours alone. A few relatives thought he was depressed. Others thought he was simply proud, too ashamed to admit his marital struggles. No one knew how dark his thoughts had become, or how close he was to acting on them. The house in Abu Nimras, a simple flat with pale walls and narrow rooms, became the stage for this brewing storm. Neighbors heard quarrels but dismissed them. After all, don't all couples argue? The silence that followed each argument seemed to reassure them that everything had settled down. But in reality, that silence was not reconciliation. It was escalation. It was the calm before the inevitable collapse. Egyptian society is no stranger to stories of domestic disputes, but this case struck a deeper nerve because of the innocent child caught in the middle. Friends of the wife described her as a gentle soul, devoted to her daughter, willing to endure unhappiness so long as her child was safe. But safety was an illusion, and in the span of one night, that illusion would shatter completely. The tragedy of Abu Nimras did not happen in isolation. It is a mirror reflecting wider issues. How communities often fail to recognize the signs of domestic abuse, how mental health struggles remain stigmatized, and how women can feel trapped in marriages that turn toxic. It is a story where silence, between husband and wife, between neighbors and authorities, became complicit in the crime itself. As the evening of that fateful day began, no one knew what was coming. The air was heavy but unremarkable, the neighborhood alive with ordinary sounds, a TV playing, a kettle whistling, children's laughter from the street below. Inside that house, however, emotions had already reached a breaking point, and within hours, Abu Nimras would wake to horror. It was the summer of 2017 when the day began like any other in Abu Nimras. The sun rose over the narrow streets, illuminating fruit carts, and vendors calling out their prices. Children chased each other down the alleys, mothers bargained in the marketplace, and men sipped tea in roadside cafes. To the outside eye, it was a day like any other, a routine day in a small Egyptian town. But inside one particular home, the clock was ticking toward disaster. The husband awoke early, restless. His eyes were dark, ringed with the weight of sleepless nights. For days he had been consumed by suspicion, convinced that his wife was keeping secrets from him. He had searched her phone more than once, interrogated her about her whereabouts, replayed conversations in his mind until they twisted into accusations. That morning, something inside him hardened into resolve. He told himself he could not live another day with doubt gnawing at him. His wife, unaware of how close the storm was, tended to their infant daughter. She sang softly as she dressed the little girl, her voice steady though her heart was heavy. She had endured her husband's anger before, but she believed, hoped, that it would pass. Perhaps if she stayed quiet, perhaps if she kept the peace, things would improve. She could not know that silence had already sealed her fate. By afternoon, neighbors recall hearing raised voices. The argument spilled through the thin walls of the home, sharp words echoing into the street. One neighbor later told investigators, "We thought it was just another fight. We didn't want to interfere." No one knocked on the door. No one intervened. The voices grew louder. Then suddenly, terrifyingly, they stopped. Inside, the husband had snapped. In the small kitchen, with its worn tiles and cracked sink, rage boiled over. Words gave way to violence. He grabbed a knife. The first strike shocked even him, but once begun, he could not, or would not, stop. Blow after blow fell upon his wife, the mother of his child, as she tried desperately to shield herself. Her screams, muffled and frantic, carried through the house. The baby cried out from the corner, her tiny voice piercing the chaos. What happened next is almost unspeakable. In a frenzy, the father turned on his own child. Whether it was to silence her, to eliminate a witness, or simply the blind continuation of his rage, no one can truly say. The knife that ended his wife's life was now raised against his daughter. Neighbors later described hearing a scream that wasn't like anything human. By the time silence returned, 2 lives had been brutally taken. The husband stood over the scene, bloodied and shaking, his breath ragged. The kitchen floor was slick with horror. Reality struck him like a wave, but instead of remorse, he felt only panic. He stumbled into the living room, his hands trembling as he realized there was no undoing what he had done. He considered fleeing, but the walls felt as though they were closing in. It was not long before the crime was discovered. A relative arrived at the home later that evening, perhaps summoned by unease, or simply by chance. The door was ajar. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The discovery that followed would forever haunt the family. The wife's body crumpled in the kitchen, the child lying still beside her. The relative's screams brought the neighborhood rushing. Within minutes, the street outside was filled with stunned faces, whispers turning into wails. The police arrived quickly. Officers sealed off the home, their expressions grim as they surveyed the scene. Photographs were taken, evidence bagged, neighbors questioned. The father, disoriented and covered in blood, was found nearby, muttering to himself. He was taken into custody without resistance. The news spread rapidly. Within hours, Abu Nimras was buzzing with disbelief. How could a man kill his own wife and child? What could drive someone to such madness? Some whispered about betrayal, others about mental illness, others still about a curse or possession. But beneath the rumors lay a deeper truth. This was not an act of supernatural forces, it was an act of silence, of rage unchecked, of warning signs ignored. He seemed so normal. That night, as the bodies were removed and the house sealed, the town mourned. Mothers held their children tighter, wives looked at their husbands with new unease, and everyone wondered, could this have been prevented if only someone had spoken out? When the police entered the home in Abu Nimras, the weight of silence was replaced by the methodical noise of investigation. Officers photographed every corner of the small flat, from the blood-stained kitchen tiles to the scattered belongings that hinted at a desperate struggle. The knife, still streaked with dried blood, lay abandoned on the counter. The baby's toys, untouched and innocent, sat just a few feet away from the site of unimaginable violence. Neighbors crowded the narrow street, craning their necks as uniformed men carried evidence bags through the doorway. Some whispered prayers, others shook their heads, muttering, "He seemed so normal." A woman clutched her scarf tightly around her, repeating over and over that she had heard screams but thought it was just another argument. Regret hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. Inside, detectives began piecing together the timeline. The relative who had discovered the crime recounted the shock of finding the bodies and the father nearby in a state of collapse. Forensics examined the wounds, noting the ferocity of the attack. There was no doubt, this was not a momentary outburst, but a prolonged, violent assault. The father was taken into custody that very evening. His clothes were soaked in blood, his face pale, his eyes wild and unfocused. At the station, he sat slumped in the interrogation room, sometimes silent, sometimes rambling. Officers pressed him with questions. Why did you do this? Was there another man? Did you plan this? His responses were inconsistent. At times he denied remembering anything. At other times he muttered accusations against his wife, claiming betrayal without evidence. Detectives seized his phone, searching for clues. They combed through messages, call logs, and social media accounts. Nothing pointed to an affair or betrayal, nothing to justify the darkness he had unleashed. What they found instead was a pattern of paranoia, endless searches about infidelity, obsessive late-night calls to relatives, and fragmented notes where he accused his wife of dishonoring him. Forensic psychologists were brought in. They listened as he recounted the weeks leading up to the murders, his sleepless nights, his constant suspicion, his conviction that everyone around him was hiding the truth. What emerged was not the portrait of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man consumed by inner demons, too proud or too afraid to seek help. The evidence was overwhelming. The weapon, the blood on his clothes, the witnesses who heard the final argument. The case was airtight, yet still, investigators probed deeper. They needed to understand not just what had happened, but why. Why does a husband turn against his own wife? Why does a father silence the very child he once cradled? The answers are rarely simple, but in the case of Abu Nimras, certain patterns emerged. Interviews with relatives revealed years of tension. The marriage, though once tender, had eroded under financial hardship and mistrust. Friends spoke of the husband's jealousy, how he checked his wife's phone, how he questioned her every movement. Others described his growing isolation, the way he stopped attending weddings, avoided family dinners, and withdrew into himself. Psychologists who studied the case noted classic signs of paranoid jealousy. He became convinced without proof that his wife was unfaithful or plotting against him. In cultures where honor and reputation are tightly bound to family dynamics, this suspicion was like fuel on fire. Instead of confronting his fears with dialogue, he let them fester. There was also the matter of pride. In Egyptian society, as in many others, men are often taught to endure silently, to see seeking help for mental struggles as weakness. To admit he was overwhelmed, to seek counseling, would have been unthinkable for him, and so his silence grew louder, echoing inside his mind until it became unbearable. Experts also pointed to stressors beyond the home. Economic hardship weighed heavily, work was scarce, money was tight. Arguments about bills and responsibilities added layers of resentment. The wife, trapped in the same cycle, grew weary. Her attempts to keep the peace were read not as love, but as distance. He mistook her quiet for betrayal. The tragedy lies in how preventable it might have been. A neighbor who knocked on the door, a relative who insisted on counseling, a society more open about mental health. Any one of these could have interrupted the cycle. But silence won. In the end, the father's motive was not clear-cut. There was no affair, no betrayal proven, no single moment that justified his rage. What there was instead was a storm of jealousy, fear, pride, and untreated mental illness. The crime was not about honor. It was about silence, isolation, and the inability to reach out before it was too late. In the weeks that followed the murders, Abu Nimras lived in a state of shock. The case spread quickly across local newspapers and television screens. Headlines described the husband as a monster, a man who had betrayed the most sacred bonds of family. Yet in the courthouse he appeared small, almost broken, a shadow of the man he once was. The trial began with heavy security. Crowds gathered outside, some driven by morbid curiosity, others by anger, demanding justice for the slain wife and child. Inside, the courtroom was tense. Journalists filled the benches, pens poised, while family members sat with grief carved into their faces. The prosecution presented its case with chilling clarity. They displayed photographs of the crime scene, the blood-stained knife, and the autopsy reports detailing the violence of the attack. Witnesses were called, neighbors who heard the screams, relatives who described the father's growing paranoia, and forensic experts who testified to the overwhelming evidence tying him to the crime. The defendant sat silent, his head bowed, his hands trembling. When asked to speak, he muttered the same fragmented phrases: accusations against his wife, denials of memory, pleas of confusion. His lawyer argued diminished responsibility, suggesting mental illness had clouded his judgment. But to the jury and the judge, the brutality of the crime outweighed sympathy. Psychological evaluations confirmed he suffered from paranoid tendencies and possible depression, but experts agreed he remained aware of his actions. He had chosen violence, they said, not under a hallucination or delusion but out of rage and obsession. The wife's family spoke through tears, demanding the harshest sentence. "She stayed for her child," one relative cried, "and both of them paid with their lives." Their words echoed in the courtroom, piercing through the legal jargon and cold evidence. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that this case was not just about one man's guilt, but about a wider question: how society responds to domestic violence. Lawyers, journalists, and citizens debated whether enough had been done to protect the wife before tragedy struck. Could warning signs have been acted upon? Could intervention have saved lives? When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty. The judge's voice was steady as he sentenced the father to the maximum penalty allowed under Egyptian law. The words landed like heavy stones, bringing a grim sense of closure, but no relief. Nothing could restore the lives that had been lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters delivered the news to a restless crowd. Some cheered the verdict, others wept, and still others shook their heads in sorrow at the waste of life. The town of Abu Nimras would never forget this case. The house where it happened would remain a grim reminder of what silence and rage can destroy. ده كان الفصل الخامس كامل. الإجراءات القانونية والمحاكمة. تحبني دلوقتي أكتب لك الفصل السادس والأخير، الانعكاسات الاجتماعية والثقافية بلس الخاتمة. علشان يبقى معاك سكريبت كامل، أنت قلت اكتب الفصل الأخير. قال تشات جي بي تي: تمام، دلوقتي هكمل لك بالفصل السادس والأخير، الانعكاسات الاجتماعية والثقافية بلس الخاتمة. النص إنجليزي بنفس الأسلوب الوثائقي، ويغلق السكريبت بالكامل بحيث يكون جاهزاً للاستخدام كفويس أوفر في الفيديو. The tragedy of Abu Nimras did not end with a courtroom verdict. It lingered, etched into the memories of neighbors, relatives, and even strangers who followed the case from afar. The house where it happened became more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol. For some, it was a warning about the dangers of unchecked anger. For others, it was a reminder of how silence can be deadly. In the weeks after the trial, discussions rippled through Egyptian households. Television programs debated the roots of domestic violence. Was it poverty? Was it jealousy? Was it untreated mental illness? Or was it something deeper, an unwillingness to confront problems until they explode? Community leaders urged vigilance. They reminded families that when arguments turn violent, intervention can save lives. Women's rights advocates used the case to highlight the vulnerability of wives trapped in toxic marriages, where leaving is seen as shameful, and seeking help is discouraged. Mental health professionals pointed to the father's paranoia and withdrawal as red flags that had gone unnoticed, symptoms that could have been treated if only he had sought help. But change does not come quickly. In towns like Abu Nimras, tradition runs deep. Neighbors often hesitate to interfere in private family matters. Silence, once again, becomes the default. And so the question lingers: will lessons be learned, or will history repeat itself in another home, on another street? The story of this crime is not just the story of one man, one woman, and one child. It is the story of a society grappling with the weight of silence. It is a call to break that silence, to speak when something feels wrong, to reach out when someone seems lost, to act before tragedy becomes inevitable. For the wife and her baby, their voices were silenced forever. But their story speaks louder than ever. It urges us to see what lies behind closed doors, to ask questions, to refuse to dismiss cries for help as just another argument. As we close this chapter, we are left with a haunting truth. Violence thrives in silence. And unless silence is broken, by neighbors, by families, by society at large, the cost will always be paid in blood. The question remains for all of us: when the signs appear again, will we turn away, or will we speak out?